George Cardinal Pell served as the Archbishop of Melbourne, Australia from 1996 to 2001 and the Archbishop of Sydney from 2001 to 2014. He was made a cardinal in 2003. In 2014, he was appointed by Pope Francis as prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy at the Vatican and also served on Pope Francis's Council of Cardinals from 2013 to 2018. The Cardinal holds a licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical Urban University in Rome, the Urbaniana, and a doctorate in church history from the University of Oxford. In 2018, His Eminence was infamously convicted on charges of sexual abuse by an Australian court, a trial that sparked international outrage and that has long been denounced as a sham and a travesty of justice. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ultimately spent 13 months in solitary confinement. The convictions were overturned by the High Court of Australia in 2020. During his time in incarceration, Cardinal Pell filled notebooks with his prison experiences, his spiritual insights, and personal reflections. These writings have been published in several volumes by Ignatius Press under the title of Prison Journal. The Cardinal joins me now. Your Eminence, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this Napa Institute interview.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm very pleased to be present across the seas. I regret that I'm not present in person, but I'm delighted to speak with you.
Well, in February 2019, you were handcuffed and taken to prison for crimes you didn't commit and literally couldn't have committed. As I just mentioned, Australia's High Court unanimously overturned your convictions and acquitted you in April 2020. What do you remember about those two very distinct moments?
Well, to start with the good news first, I was sitting quietly in my prison cell. The news was people were waiting for the High Court verdict in Canberra. It was covered by the major news channels. I can remember the astonishment of the young reporter when it was announced that the High Court had found in my favor, and then he was doubly astonished when he learned that it was 7-0 in my favor. I punched the air quietly a couple of times and then read the Te Deum, the traditional prayer of thanks. I regretted I didn't have a Latin translation. I could only remember the first few verses in Latin, but I prayed that to thank God for for all the blessings that I'd received, and especially for that final verdict. In a certain sense, Australian justice was on trial, just as I had been, and it was good for me and good for the system.
Are there particular things that you noticed about the people or the things surrounding those particular moments?
Well, I remember when the guilty verdict was being read out by the chairman of the jury. That was an enormous surprise to me, although the jury had been arguing for days. I remember him glancing at me furtively to see my reactions. As far as I was concerned, it was, I was never tempted to think it was a bad dream. I knew it was very real. It was the latest piece in a series of bad news, pieces of bad news. I'd been interrogated, charged. I'm tempted to say on the flimsiest of evidence, but there was no evidence except the complaint. So I certainly remember that. I remember after the not guilty verdict from the High Court, I was completely alone in the cell. A cheer went up from another part of the prison. The other prisoners who there were 3 others in our section. They congratulated me, but there was deathly silence from the warders. So they came eventually and opened my door, well, once again in complete silence, and so I opened the door and they were standing there silently. I said, "Any news?" And so there was silence. I said, "Well, actually, I've just been released. I've been free." And I think he said, "You know, surprises will never cease." I said, "This was no surprise. It was justice." But no, they were pleasant enough, and of course it was a COVID time, and I was pursued by helicopters, and I heard of a cartoon which said you're not allowed to travel more than 5 kilometers from home, except when you're following Cardinal Pell interstate.
Well, when you look back on your 13 months in a jail cell, what were the lowest moments? What were the hardest things in that experience?
Probably the lowest moment was when the Victorian Appeal Court, two of the head of the Supreme Court and the head of the Court of Appeal, reversed the onus of justice and put their names to an appalling judgment. There was a dissenting judgment, which is now widely regarded as a masterpiece by Justice Weinberg, an absolutely brilliant piece of work. It was the basis of the High Court decision. I'm enormously grateful to him for the quality of his work and for the detail and the obviously many hours that he had put into it. Yeah. So the Court of Appeal decision was a low point. Generally, my time in jail wasn't too bad at all. It wasn't the Hilton Hotel, but it was far from the worst of jails. My criminal friends say that the Victorian jails are probably the best jails in Australia for prisoners. Strip searches were very undignified, but all in all, I was in isolation. I was left to myself. I had plenty of mail, could get books regularly, journal articles. I had a television and I had a kettle. And on my retreats over the years, I hadn't had in my room either of those things. So it was a sort of worldly retreat.
How was it, though, not celebrating Mass daily for the first time in some 50 years?
Well, it was a big change, but it didn't cause me grief in the way that some people have thought it might have, and even perhaps I had considered. I knew God was with me. I had my breviary. The authorities were very decent in that regard. I had my breviary from the very first night. Eventually, I had a prison rosary. It was all made of linen, cotton, and no metal, so you couldn't strangle anybody. I had no spiritual reading, so I felt God was with me, and that I was able to pray. And one of the important things when you're in a bad situation, especially in jail, you've got to admit to yourself that you are where you are. I was in jail. They wouldn't let me say Mass. And that was it. I had to just get on with things.
Yeah. How did the guards and even the other prisoners treat you?
Well, the other prisoners, one young fellow abused me. He was in the next exercise cell. He spat at me. That was the only, and I was in isolation, so I was removed from most of the prisoners, except for the last 3 or 4 months when I was able to talk through plastic walls to transparent plastic to 3 other prisoners who were terrific to me, very good to me. The guards were basically very decent. The leadership was very fair and good towards me. Obviously, some of them were a bit narky and a little bit unsympathetic. It was interesting, the 3 prisoners I had access to eventually, 2 of them were Muslims. They very much regarded me as a fellow believer, not as a Muslim, as a fellow theist. And one of the Muslim prisoners said, it's interesting, he said, the guards who are unhappy and the guards who tended to be a little bit nasty or narky, he said, they're the ones that don't have any faith, don't believe in anything. I don't know whether it was true, but it was an interesting claim.
Yeah. Well, you received mail in prison, a lot of it from people you never actually met. What were the percentages like, the good to the bad, and what are the things you remember most vividly from those letters?
Well, there were very few hostile letters. I've received very few hostile letters, even since I've left jail. I might have had a half a dozen in jail. Now, they might have realized that all my mail was read, but no, so it was overwhelmingly favorable, and from all sorts of people, Catholics, devout Christians, in many, many countries of the world, many from the United States. They were the biggest number apart from Australia. Britain, many parts of Europe. The catechumenal network throughout the world was praying for me. So too my Opus Dei friends. I received a lot of support from very fair-minded non-believers. Some of my strongest supporters are in that category. And also there were a number of Catholics whose theology is very different from mine, but realized the injustice of my situation and publicly supported me. Yeah. 1 or 2 of them have paid a severe price with their trendy friends. One of them had for years written with the Progressive magazine, and the other writers, in their lack of wisdom, said that if he was going to continue to write, they would cease. So he ceased. He stopped writing for them, and his only crime was that he explained my case and supported me and said I was wrongfully convicted.
Yeah. What made you decide to keep a prison journal? And one of the questions that a lot of people I know want to ask is, how did you manage actually to write a journal?
Well, I wrote a thesis in church history, patristics. I'm very interested in history. I've spoken on different topics for many years. I realized that it's somewhat unusual for a cardinal to be imprisoned, and I thought for the historical record that it might be useful to write these things down, which I proceeded to do. So I had, because of the busy life I led in the past, I had a habit of doing a lot of writing when I came home at night at 9 or so. And so I got used to writing in the evening, and so I wrote 3 handwritten pages a day. The first few days I felt impelled to conclude each day with a prayer. And then I decided to do that every day. a number of people have said they're grateful for that. I realized after a week or two or so that my capacity for prayer writing was nothing like that of Cardinal Newman or Thomas More, and so from the breviary, from the letters, I took beautiful prayers from here, there, and everywhere. I wasn't sure how interested publishers would be in publishing it. It wasn't. It was written with the hope that it would help people who were struggling. I thought they might be interested in publishing some of it. Ignatius Press, in their wisdom, decided to print all of it. It's now been reprinted in some of it, at any rate, in 6 languages. And I've received a lot of comments from persons whose judgment I value, saying that they found it not just readable, but they gained strength and help from reading it. And I'm really pleased with that. It's it's a little consequence of providence. God writes straight and crooked lines, but of course, if I hadn't been in prison, I would never have written a book like that. And some people say it is making a bit of a contribution.
Yeah. Well, how did you deal with your anger at your accuser, the media, and what was an obviously compromised judicial process?
Well, I was tempted to be more angry with some rather than others, but I remember hearing a married woman, a very good woman from Marriage Encounter. She was talking about little difficulties or big difficulties between husband and wife. And she said the important thing is to decide to forgive, and then generally your feelings follow on your decision. So I decided I was going to forgive. It's a little bit like faith. You've got to continue to decide to forgive, because you can make a good decision, a proper decision at one time, and then find that you're tempted to be succumbing to resentment. I was speaking with a member from the Emmanuel community who did a lot with the surviving victims in Rwanda after tens of thousands of people there were slaughtered, often by their fellow Catholics. And he said the people there would make it a decision to forgive, but sometimes they would have to explicitly renew that because they had these surges of resentment. Yeah. I probably misjudged my accuser, whom of course I'd never met. I don't remember meeting him as a choir boy, and I never met him subsequently. I thought he was quite a broken man. I think there's no doubt he's quite damaged, but it's emerged since that he's quite a political activist. He doesn't espouse violence, but he's probably a bit of almost a Trotskyite. That he publishes regularly. I wasn't aware of that when he was accusing me. I never and still don't feel enormous hostility towards him, although he changed his story 24 times. I was tempted to be more agitated by and hostile to some of the people on the other side legally, who I felt were consistently working to obscure the situation rather than to bring clarity. Now, I suppose that's what they, in some senses, what they're paid to do. They were certainly quite successful. So it took a bit more of an effort to forgive them, although I realized they were much less capable than many others.
If I can shift focus for just a moment, you worked very hard during your latter years in Rome to clean up the many problems in Vatican finances, including some serious governance issues with the Vatican Bank. In your view, has any real progress been made since you left in 2018? And in your view, too, what problems remain?
Yes, no, I think there's no doubt that there is continuing progress. We've introduced, the procedures that are used across the first world for appropriate accounting. So it is much more difficult to steal money in the Vatican than when it was. I believe we've stopped the basic corruption. I might be mistaken on that, but I hope not, and I believe not. The basic problem is that the Vatican is spending more than it's earning, and that it has a looming deficit in the pension fund. So I think the corruption has been contained, if not eliminated. But they've got to face up to the financial situation. You can't just keep losing tens of millions every year. And through at least 3 major mishaps in the last 40 years or so, the Vatican has lost at least 500 million, more by contemporary values. They had to pay out 200, I think it was 230 million in the Banco Ambrosiano scandal in the 80s. They sold off your properties. I don't know, I think it was 59 million less than their real value. And of course, they've done 150 million in the Sloane Avenue property in London. Well, those sort of mishaps have got to stop.
Yeah.
And the processes are in place to prevent that. We were prevented from, and the auditor, the external auditors were sacked. The chief auditor was dismissed. We were prevented from getting into the Secretariat of State. If we had done so, we had some idea that they had expended money there, but if we had got in earlier, the story would have been quite different, and I suspect the losses would have been significantly less.
Yeah. Well, Pope Francis has certainly made efforts to improve the way the Vatican bureaucracy works and serves the universal church, but what exactly would effective Vatican reform look like? And given the inertia of old bureaucracies and the record of history, is real structural reform possible?
Oh, yes. Well, reform is always possible when you have the right reformers and when they are explicitly backed by whoever is effectively running the place.
Yeah.
Some elements in the Curia are, the overwhelming majority of people who work there are fine people. Some elements of the Curia are very efficient. Some of them still are a little bit behind the 8 ball. Yeah. High Vatican official layman who was retiring gave me a book about the Japanese in the late 19th century. And the people running Japan sent a high-level delegation of 20 or 30 Japanese leaders around the world to discover the best practice in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, and other places. And this delegation of Japanese leaders went around the world and discovered what was best practice, came back and implemented it. Something like that would probably be quite useful in the Vatican. Yeah. So yes, all things are possible. Some things are achieved with greater difficulty.
Well, after all you've been through, why do you believe? We call God holy and good, but for a good God, there seems to be a deep well of pure malice and pain in the world. You know that better than anyone.
No, I don't know it better than anyone. Many, many people have suffered much, much more than myself. Think, for example, of the victims of war, victims of aggression in the Ukraine. But I certainly believe in original sin, that flaw that runs through our hearts and through society. I remember reading about an old pre-Vatican II atheist who said that the dogma of original sin was the only Christian dogma that he believed in. But we follow Christ. We don't follow any cardinal or bishop or pope. In a basic sense, we don't even follow one of the prophets, good prophets. We follow Jesus Christ. And Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. That's the basis of our Christian faith, and that is logically quite distinct from human optimism. Allegedly, G.K. Chesterton said that the virtue of Christian hope is only really possible when the situation is hopeless. Now, I don't go along with that, but even when the situation is humanly hopeless, we still have Christian hope, the virtue of Christian hope. Yeah. Well, it's tied up very much, basically, with our faith. And if I could roam a little bit more widely, although we've got great problems with sexuality and family and marriage and life, the basic challenge in the West is to faith in the Creator God, the supreme, transcendent God of love, who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Father of Jesus. It's that faith that is under pressure. And the notion that God or his Son will judge, he won't be inclusive at the end time, dividing the sheep from the goats. Of course, that is deeply offensive to many people who describe themselves as autonomous, morally and also doctrinally.
Well, you've anticipated my final question, which is that in countries like Australia and the United States, the culture is going through what we might call a period of conflict and confusion, and the church faces some very serious challenges. Why should we hope? What gives you hope? And why is this a good time, maybe even the best time, to be a Christian?
Well, I certainly don't agree that it's the best time to be a Christian. I think in Australia and probably in the United States, the cost of discipleship has risen and might even continue to rise. But having said that, there were many, many situations which are worse in a secular sense, times of war, times of natural disaster, times of radical poverty. And there are many times, too, when the situation of the church has been worse. Periods of radical corruption in the 10th and 11th century in the papacy, for example, in Rome, or in different, say, in Italy at the time of the Reformation. So it's certainly it's always a good time to be a Christian because, Christ brings us the Maker's instructions. Christ tells us what life is about. And the church in the Western world, as exemplified in Germany, we face a fundamental option. Do we continue to believe that we are the servants and defenders of the apostolic tradition, which brings us Christ's teaching as transmitted to us by the apostles? Or do we arrogantly and mistakenly believe we are the masters of that tradition, and so we can change it? We've got an intolerable situation where senior continental churchmen, 2 or 3 of them, have announced quite explicitly that they do not accept the basic teachings of the church on sexual morality. Well, that's an intolerable situation, and I'm quite sure that Rome will deal with it explicitly in some way. It's a duty to do so. So we follow Jesus. That's the man we preach. The church in the West has been weakened by the scourge of pedophilia, but in a certain sense, we've cut out a cancer. I suspect that there are nothing like the number of offences that there were in Christian families and in church institutions. Although there is a great veil of silence, at least in Australia, about the pedophilia in non-institutional situations. But God is good and God is with us, and God's providence is always at work.
Well, Your Eminence, we'll leave it there. I'm very grateful for your time, and be assured of the prayers of so many around the world.
No, I'm enormously grateful for those prayers, and they have come almost literally from all around the world.
Well, that concludes our interview with George Cardinal Pell for the Napa Institute. I'm Matthew Bunson.